All right, so we begin to now look at Chapter 35, looking at nationalism and political identity in the areas of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And the Caribbean also. One thing to consider is that this is essentially what's going on in between World War I and World War II in just the other parts of the world that we have yet to discuss beyond, obviously, Europe. So essentially what we're looking at is explaining how different governments responded to the economic crisis. So again, going back to the Great Depression after 1900, so after World War I and the Depression itself. Explaining continuities and changes in territorial holdings, so looking at, again, colonialism and imperialism as that continues at this point in the world, and also explaining the causes and consequences of China's adoption to communism, which we'll obviously refer back to when we get to the end of World War II. So to begin with, we're going to talk about and rehash a little bit of some ideas here going back from the end of World War I because of that promise of greater freedom. So many colonial subjects had, served in World War I again as either soldiers, as litter bearers, as medics, working in factories, working as farmers to produce food for, colonial, or for the, countries that are currently holding onto their territory. So like for the British, the French, the Germans, and they find it, or at least promised, as an idea or an acceptance that this will hopefully lead to independence for said service. There we have kind of our listings of those areas. So many of the colonized in, especially like within Africa and also within Asia, are now being trained by Europeans to kill other Europeans or to kill other white men. Which, for them, that's kind of a first in history, is that the other white men are encouraging them to kill other whites, where typically that had been frowned upon, no matter what the nationality had been in the past. So at the same time, because more and more Europeans are being pulled from colonial territories and colonial holdings to go fight and serve in the war, that also leads to fewer Europeans that are actually in the colonies to oversee this. So there again is an expansion of freedom and opportunities, especially for, again, upper classes and upper educated peoples inside these colonies to gain greater, training, administration duties, and again, moving towards that idea of becoming, elite and free. So this also helps to weaken the perception that Europeans are racially superior because they're seeing whites die in very high mass numbers, but also the fact that they are loosening their own grip because of, the war drawing their attention away from their colonies. All right, and so as we said, those spots are vacant, or those vacated spots by the bureaucrats and by the soldiers are filled in with people from their respective colonies or respective territories. Obviously, racism continues, unfortunately, within that to help push for why, they should want freedom, but also exporting of cash crops and raw materials, so again, primary activities at the expense of their own industries, lower food production, to again increase the profits and the amount of abilities for the Europeans to be successful. All right, so it leads to more resistance against colonialism throughout all of these territories, whether that's in India, Africa, South and Southeast Asia, that are unfortunately not successful at this time, but does lead to increased pressures on the Europeans and will continue to press forward going it, beyond World War II, and will have obviously long-lasting consequences in the sense that eventually they will earn their freedom, but it comes, unfortunately, after or long after they've been promised that within World War I. And some of those we've already kind of talked about a little bit within their own political movements, again, going back to, India itself being one of those areas. So, and then there's obviously, that whole thing back to the idea of popular sovereignty that ties back in, or, self-determination and popular sovereignty from, the Treaty of Versailles. But again, that's only promised to Europeans with European intentions. So a lot of them, again, are very baffled by that, as we kind of talked about within, Vietnam and Ho Chi Minh. So to look predominantly at one case study here in this video, and then we'll, move to other ones in the next few videos, is Gandhi and nonviolence. So the Indian National Congress is formed kind of in the late 1800s to essentially lead this Indian nationalist movement as, India is becoming kind of a, as a cohesive British colony, starting to come together via the railroads and, the British colonial system to actually working towards unification. Now, Britain wants to unify that and work that together to be, the crown jewel of the British Empire and to get, Great Britain more and more money. And more wealth and prestige, and use India as the example to hold up to, this is what colonies should be when it's not a settler colony like New Zealand, Australia, or Canada. So within the Indian National Congress itself, being a much older nationalist movement prior to World War I is kind of where it starts, is led by Indian elites. So as many cases as we'll see in many of these locations around the globe that are leading anti-imperialist, anti-colonial activities, they're led by people who have been educated under Western systems, whether that's within their own countries at elite schools or have been sent abroad to places within Europe to get this education and training and background. So essentially what the Indian National Congress wants to do is to work initially within the British system to earn independence and prove that they can adapt to Western ways to be successful and earn their independence, right? So their eventual leader is Mahatma Gandhi, all right? So Gandhi, big advocate of nonviolence using Hinduism and his idea of, divine, I'm trying to remember the exact terminology here, but essentially using nonviolence and his interpretation of Hindu scripture to say that we should protest aggressively but non-violently. So what he means by that is to focus on economic protests and boycotts. So essentially cut off the British by essentially making sure that they don't make money off of Indian goods. So they want to boost the Indian businesses and not Britain because they want to go against the normal trade practices. So the idea of the salt march in terms of instead of us shipping our salt and our cotton away, we'll grow all this stuff and then we'll ship it to Britain, and then Britain will ship us back as a finished product that we have to buy. Instead, let's produce it on our own, and that way we can make more money on our own and nationalize our own industries. Because again, the idea is you got to hurt them where it counts. When it comes to the British Empire, is money. Violence they couldn't compete with because they don't have the resources to do it. And also, again, Gandhi did not believe that violence would lead to a peaceful mean of transition of power. He believed that violence would just lead to more deaths, although every time that they would, in many cases, protest peacefully, especially in the early 1920s at Amritsar, led to the British, firing on innocent crowds. But again, that just kind of put more and more pressure on the British to eventually, give in to the Indian movement, following World War II. So they also would advocate, and again, Gandhi pushing for this too, refusing to send Indian kids to British schools, to pay British taxes, buy goods that are made or bought in Great Britain. So that includes salt and yarn that were, again, produced and found within India, to, again, buy more locally and kind of disrupt that mercantilist system and focus on producing goods to sell directly to Indians, not to Indians through a British company. So again, instead of shipping it to Great Britain to then resell to India, keep it within India, and thus more of the wealth will stay here, was the kind of idea behind that. So Britain does give in a little bit, during this time period, between, 1890 and, World War II, with the India Act. I believe that was 1929, 1930, which Indians gained the right to elect their local leaders and form a legislature. Although it's not full independence, it's again moving in that direction towards, self-determination by proving to the British under the British system that they can, in fact, run their own affairs. And there's still obviously a lot of mistrust between Muslims and non-Muslims, princes and magistrates, because a lot of them don't want to give up their own power to a greater system. If they already have to give it up to the British, they don't want to give up to another local prince they might have a rivalry with. So that also was a unfortunate, consequence here of that mistrust of the fact that India itself has really never been a fully united national group. You also have the religious differences between the Muslims and the Hindus. All right, so the Muslim League forms kind of as a counterpart to the Indian National Congress, which was controlled and run predominantly by Hindus. As at the same time that we're talking about this, when we talk about plantations and farms that are not run by the British, other ones that are controlled predominantly by wealthy Hindu princes and landlords. So they're controlling the local economy, the farms, and Muslims are mostly the laborers in many of these areas, or a high percentage of laborers and a very small percentage of the actual landowners. So they feel subjugated and do not trust Hindus based on the socioeconomic disparities that exist, and that is actually something that still kind of rings true even within India today. And so this will unfortunately lead to the splitting of India into three countries, which will be India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Bangladesh and Pakistan being predominantly, again, based along that separation of religious lines. So, and this is going to be kind of the idea that India will lead the way to many of those independence movements through hopefully peaceful means, or more peaceful means and boycotts. So I think that's kind of a very good start for us to look at here within the idea of, that promise of freedom following, the European structure and the European system, but use it with nonviolence and use it within the, system that is set up to protest aggressively but peacefully and hurt them in the economic sector to earn their freedom and get more political power over time. So in the next video, we will jump ahead to China and Japan. So that will come up in video number 2.